And tonight's tale. There is nothing wrong with me or my husband. The Communication, Part 2. It was a cool evening. The lights were just beginning to question changing colour, and the breezes rolling through the yard were not unpleasantly cold. We had taken to wearing a light sweater around the house, which tended to be a little draughty. But I had taken it off and slung it around the back of a kitchen chair as my husband pulled into the drive. I was sweating slightly from my session with the ouija board. We had contacted plenty of spirits before and had experiences ranging from the bizarre to the downright frightening, but we had never communicated with a spirit that did not know it was a spirit. Rather than leaving me cold, I was too warm, sweating slightly, and my cheeks, I knew, had a rosy tinge from the feverish way that I hunched over the board, watching the planchard zip round. Poor Cody. He suffered a horrible fall that left him paralysed and trusting in his friends to send help, only to be betrayed by those friends, his life cut short in a brutally violent way. Now he was lost, stuck in the dark and cold of the afterlife limbo, forever waiting for an ambulance that was never going to arrive. I shook my head and pulled a glass from the cabinet above the sink before filling it with water. I had just taken a long drink when the back door of the kitchen opened and my husband James walked through the door with a little breeze carrying the faintest hints of autumn wind. Just coming home from work, he deposited his lunchbox on the little table by the window and leaned against the door as he kicked off his shoes. I greeted him with a smile and a kiss on the cheek. "How was work, babe? I'm just looking at dinner. Hungry for anything in particular?" I asked this every day, and every day I was greeted with that huge smile of his that always melted my heart, even when we were teenagers. The way the light always seemed to gleam off those perfect, pearly white teeth made my knees grow weak. We decided to order some pizza rather than cooking, and I got on the telephone to place our usual order at our favourite spot before heading into the living room. James sat in his favourite recliner, reached for the remote, and turned on the TV to the local news on low. I sat on the end of the sofa nearest to him, my favourite spot to curl up. As with every day, he told me about work and the guys that he worked with. They were gearing up for an OSHA inspection soon. The new guy managed to screw up £150 of steel. The office girl was finally out on maternity leave. All the normal things that you would expect from a factory worker. I asked questions where appropriate, enjoying our little daily download, as we called it. When he finished, I told him about my day. As a writer, I worked from home and did not interact much with other people too often, outside of my publisher and occasionally customer service for an online order that had some sort of problem. So I told him instead about the progress that we made on my current novel. All about how the protagonist had found their way through the haunted forest and reached a cabin sparkling in light. About my plans to introduce the love interest turned monster, and my vague ideas for the twist at the end, where the protagonist had been the monster all along. He listened patiently, nodding along, and throwing out suggestions for scenery or magical powers that might appear. All in all, James and I had a pretty perfect marriage, with the kind of communication that other couples would be envious of. We supported each other and could tell each other anything. No secrets, no fears of holding back. So I normally had no reservations about sharing with him my experiences with divination, or the spirits that I contacted through my rituals, even if he was clearly not very interested, and only gave his focus to my tales because it was expected, rather than having investment himself, but that was fine with me. I had started to tell him about my newest encounter with a spirit named Cody, and how he had been a skater kid, just like James had been when I met him. He sat stark still for a moment when I mentioned the name, his normally jovial expression becoming a mask of stone for a moment as he leaned forward in his chair towards me as I spoke. No sooner had I noticed the change in his expression when there was a rather loud knock on the front door. The pizza had arrived. James jumped up and headed to the door, pulling his wallet out of his back pocket as he went. I too got up and headed to the kitchen after some plates and a knife to cut the pizza with. We loved this place, High Street Pizzeria. They had great prices, even better pizza, and fast delivery. They were really bad at cutting the pizza all the way through though, and if you tried to pull a slice directly from the box, you're going to lose all the cheese and toppings in the process. We met James in the living room and laid the pair of plates and a knife on the coffee table as he set the box down, the smells of hot cheese and greasy pepperoni reaching my nostrils. I smiled at him again and asked what he wanted to drink, before whisking back off to the kitchen after a glass for him, refilling my own water glass from the counter while he extracted slices from the box and served them up on plates. I nabbed 2 paper napkins from the holder in the counter on my way back and sat down, ready for a nice little guilty pleasure meal. Thoughts of my ouija session mostly forgotten in favour of hot, greasy pizza. We started eating in silence, zoning out of the noise for a few minutes. A new construction project downtown was seeking to renovate parts of the old warehouse district. The mayor had made another gaffe at the town hall meeting last night. A pet of the week segment from the local animal shelter. All the usual stuff, really. After James had finished his first slice and was rounding on his second, he prompted me to go on with my story about the skater kid. I perked up at the prodding, pulling my legs up onto the sofa, crossed like a child in school, and balanced my plate there while I started telling him more about it, delighted by the interest he was showing tonight. He ate in silence, his eyes trained on me, with that sparkling brightness that they always had when he was particularly excited about something. And I told him everything Cody had relayed in his communications, my pizza forgotten on the plate and growing cold. I didn't care though. I loved when James got excited and passionate like this. When I got to the part about the watch factory, he seemed particularly interested and even asked if Cody had mentioned where it was. Maybe it would be possible to look it up and see if any such death had been reported in the news, he said. Unfortunately, Cody didn't mention anything about what city he was from, only some vague details about the landscape and a couple of businesses. James also seemed particularly interested in the group of friends that Cody had mentioned, asking questions about them, if Cody had described what they looked like, or given last names for any of them. Again, I had to tell him no. Cody, I think, was more interested in telling his own story than anything else, really. If that disappointed James at all, he didn't show it, and it didn't seem to dull his interest in the tale, not one bit. James, I think, never really put much stock in my stories of communicating with the dead. Most likely, he thought it was my writer's imagination running wild. But tonight, he seemed genuinely interested, even offering commentary from his time as a skate kid himself. He had skated in some abandoned warehouses with other kids when he was that age as well. Yes, they were pretty much dusty and covered in graffiti, just like Cody had described. And while he didn't personally drink or smoke back then, plenty of other kids did. He was interested in the way that Cody described the coldness he felt, the feeling of nothingness creeping over his body as he lay paralysed on the floor, and suggested that he had heard something similar before, but he couldn't remember where. Some book or movie or something, maybe. He agreed wholeheartedly that it sounded terrible, and repeated my sentiment of feeling bad for Cody, not knowing he was dead, but waiting endlessly in the dark for his friends to get him help. We talked about the story that Cody had told for most of the night, while we cleaned up for dinner, as James helped me fold the laundry from the dryer and lay out fresh clothes for him for work in the morning. Even while I took a shower, James hanging in the bathroom doorway while we talked. Nights like this didn't happen often. Work had a way of leaving him in a bad mood when he got home, which I suppose is why he changed jobs so often. Not that I blamed him for wanting to find a job that he enjoyed working at. But when nights like this did happen, I always cherished every moment of them and dreaded climbing into bed next to him at the night, knowing that the magic would end as soon as we fell asleep. I loved our life together, but I had to admit, being a stay-at-home writer got pretty lonely sometimes when he was out at work all day. We had tried adopting a dog a few months ago from a local shelter to help ease the loneliness of the empty house. A 4-year-old German Shepherd Border Collie mix named Belle. She was a sweet little thing, but had had a hard life and couldn't adjust to being here in the house with me. Even with frequent walks and playtime, she would chew on everything, including the furniture, and refused to do her business outside. After about a month, James finally made me realise that she wasn't a good fit. I cried when he left with her to bring her back to the shelter, but he was right, of course. She had a much better chance at a family taking care of her, where she'd have land to roam and explore and burn off all of her energy if she were at the shelter to be adopted, rather than me sitting at home trying to find her new home with social media. As I climbed into bed that night, and I tucked myself in under his arm, my head against his chest, I decided he had been in a good enough mood to press my luck and broach the subject of getting a new dog. It had been a few months, after all. We could go down to the shelter this weekend, we said, and meet a few. Maybe we would find one who was a better fit than Bill, and it sure would make me feel a lot better being alone in the house all the time. Admittedly, I did play up my fears a little bit, saying that my session with Cody had left me much more uneasy than I truly felt. James laughed and ruffled my hair before kissing the top of my head when I told him how I feared being cold and alone in the dark without him there. He agreed that we would head to the shelter this weekend, but made no promises about bringing a new dog home. And, he jokingly added, no more scaring myself with a ouija board for a while. I went to sleep shortly after that. I awoke the next morning as the sun poked through the curtains about 10 a.m. That was the nice part about staying home. I never had to set an alarm and could wake up whenever I felt like it. James, of course, was already gone for the day, night out grabbing lunch that I packed him out of the refrigerator on his way out the door before the sun had even risen. I stretched and climbed out of bed, straightening the sheets and covers before shuffling off to the bathroom to brush my teeth. I ran my brush under the sink, squirted some toothpaste onto it, dipped it back under the flow of water for a second, and lifted it to my mouth, catching the first glimpse of my face for the day in the mirror, when I froze. A cold sweat pooled at once on the back of my neck, the little hairs pricking up as they moved to stand on end, and a tingle ran down my spine, making me jump as it slowly made its way towards my lower vertebrae. My legs tingled as if they had fallen asleep, and my bare toes flexed instinctively against the cold tiles of the bathroom floor in an effort to rebalance my weight. All of these things happened in the same instant, and as my head tilted back slightly with the force of the little jerking moment, my eyes shifted off of the mirror, only to refocus once more on my reflection. It was perfectly clear. My perfectly normal face looked just as shocked from my brief moment of fear as I would have expected it to. The shower behind me, with its soft purple shower curtain, was illuminated by a ray of light that managed to cross the room from the window and into the bathroom door. As I looked down over the top of my chest, my pyjama pants were a bit wrinkled as they made their way down my legs, the edge hanging just about an inch above the tile floor, which was partially bathed in the morning light, partially in the shadowed side of the bathroom. I hadn't bothered to turn on the light, since it was enough natural light to see by. I turned around to look at the shower curtain behind me, bewildered more by its normalcy than by any preternatural source. It was just the same as it had ever been, perhaps even more normal than usual, as if it were trying to project an air of normalcy rather than identify itself as uncanny. I turned again more slowly back to the mirror, my expression falling. My hair was a mess. I must have been tossing around in my sleep last night. A little laugh bubbled in my throat, and I smiled at myself in the mirror, bringing the toothbrush back up to my mouth to give them a good scrubbing. Poor James. He always hates when I move around like an octopus, as he called it. I hoped I hadn't hit him in my sleep like I had a couple of times, apparently. We had never seen a bruise from one of these late-night jabs or a knee or elbow, but he assures me that they've happened. But it's still weakly because I don't hit him very hard when I'm shifting about. We definitely have to take care of this hair. I finished brushing my teeth and rinsed the sink out before depositing my toothbrush into its little holder fixed on the wall, rubbing my eyes as I made my way to the nightstand to collect my hairbrush. This mop top had to go. I brushed out my hair and threw it into a messy little bun and shrugged off my pyjamas, dropped them into the laundry basket by the bedroom door. I would need to do laundry tomorrow. There's almost enough for a full load. I pulled on some fresh clothes and a big, wispy cardigan and made my way downstairs to the kitchen to make a cup of coffee, cell phone in hand. As I stood in the kitchen, waiting for the coffee machine to brew and spit out my steaming hot liquid pick-me-up, I scrolled through the news on my phone. The president was on the front page of all the news sites, once again, for outraging the opposing party with some comment. There was unrest in the Middle East, and something vague was happening in Russia that we should definitely be afraid of. 7 people were injured in another preventable fire in a public building. That big daddy tech guy was going to launch a rocket to Mars. A typical Friday morning newsfeed. I switched away from the national news and started scrolling one-handed as I collected a spoon, almond milk, and some sugar from the cabinets and fridge and set them down next to the coffee maker as it started hissing and began pouring my coffee. There's a rash of vehicles being broken into in the surrounding cities, and victims were sharing their tips on how to protect their valuables. The local college basketball team had made the playoffs for whatever league they were part of. Some developer was planning to build a 10-story apartment house for senior citizens. Flu season was predicted to be the worst one yet. Nothing of interest, really, as I absent-mindedly fixed my coffee and headed back upstairs to my office to settle in behind my desk and boot up my computer. I checked my email like I did every morning when I was waiting on feedback or revision requests from my editor, drinking coffee from my favourite mug. Not a bad life, I had to admit. After responding to my editor, we assured her that I would get her the revised copy sent out by Tuesday, and I go to work going over the draft of my latest novella, making changes as she suggested. It was after 2 p.m. or so when I finally looked up from my work, realising that I was getting quite peckish. I rolled my neck around and side to side a few times, then stood up to stretch. I had a bad habit of hunching over my keyboard when I was working on something that required a lot of intensity, like creating whole worlds with text, and I was a little stiff. I threw my shoulders back and lifted my arms above my head, curving outward and yawning. My long, empty coffee cup in my right hand as I did so. Just as I was unstretching my body back to its normal standing position, it happened again. An icy chill washed over my body, as if the air itself had been plunged into cold water before rolling its way down my body in a frigid cloud. All over, my skin tightened and constricted against itself. Goosebumps pricking to life, making all the fine hairs stand straight up. My ears felt frozen, as if I had been standing out in the winter wind without a hat on, burning slightly from the cold. And once again, the icy cold shiver ran in a slow, deliberate wave down my spine, rolling over itself on its way down like a ball of spite ice, freezing any nearby organs as it made its way down. All the strength went from my arms as my fingers at once flexed, then contracted violently in response, and the coffee cup slipped from my hands to shatter to the hardwood floor. I shouted at the sound of the breaking porcelain mug as it fell, and I jumped back out of the way of any flying shards or pieces, let they cut or embedded themselves into my foot. I looked down and laughed at myself. Darn, my reflexes were getting pretty good. Not a single piece of porcelain had hit me. I was stupid, though, to drop the mug. We tended to be really clumsy. James had always said it was because I don't pay enough attention to what I'm doing. Ah well. I made my way to the kitchen after the broom, still shaking my head. So much for my favourite mug. That was a bummer. But I would spend some time later tonight to find a new one. It was probably time for a change anyway. The inside was irreparably stained at this point, and no amount of scrubbing was going to get rid of that ring of old bean juice. Maybe I could find matching tumblers for James and I. He did like his coffee in the morning. I retrieved the broom and dustpan and headed back to my office, watching my feet carefully on the stairs, struck with a sudden sense of hyper-realism. I was conscious of every slight contraction of muscle as my leg moved to raise my leg just high enough to clear the top of the stair, of my weight as it shifted to pull myself up, of the soft rustling sound that my skin made on the bottom of my foot as it lifted off the carpet floor, of the slight tension in my arms as they held the broom aloft without dragging on the ground, and of the tightness in my fingers as they gripped the dustpan handle where it connected to the broom, and I noticed how white my knuckles were from the exertion, holding onto the broom in a terrified grip of some horror that I did not feel on a conscious level. No sooner had I noticed that I was holding the broom rather tightly, my fingers relaxed into a more easy grip, and I shook my head, the hyper-focus on every small detail of everything just faded. I really needed to cut back on the caffeine. It was starting to mess with me again. This always seemed to happen when I was in a serious bout of writing. It could be really useful for making details come to life, and my readers enjoyed that, we think. But it also had a tendency to be more than a little unnerving. I swept up the shattered mug, and swept along under my desk as well, just to make sure that I got any really small pieces that I couldn't see with my eyes, and pushed them into the dustbin before heading back downstairs to throw them away and replace the broom to its wanted position in the hall closet. I hoped James wouldn't be upset that I dropped the mug. It had been a gift from him a couple of years ago for Christmas. It was a white mug with a small portrait of a fairy sitting on a mushroom on it. I had never been particularly into fairies or those kinds of fantasy scenes, but I grew to love the mug anyway, because it was from James. And because of that, all of James's presents to me were now fairy themed. I didn't have the heart to tell him that they weren't really my thing, and it became a sort of inside joke that we shared with myself. Besides, it's not like it mattered what the gift was. It was the fact that he thought to get me anything at all. And the fact that he makes an active effort to get me fairies because he thinks I like them really makes the gifts thoughtful, doesn't it? I settled back in behind my computer for a few minutes, having decided to forgo food after all, and pulled up my word processor. I was supposed to be working on edits and revisions for the novella, but an idea had popped into my mind for a new story. I knew better than to try to stop the ideas when they were flowing, and just to let them go out onto the page while they were swirling around in my mind. We definitely wouldn't end up finishing the story all in one go, but if I built the world that was brimming over in my mind, where the ideas were there, we could teleport back into it at some time in the future and turn it into a story that it deserved at a later date. So, that is exactly what I did. We just began writing, describing the scene in my mind, setting the tone of the room that I envisioned, mapping out a few starting characters that would tell me their stories at a later date. My fingers clacked gently against the keys on the keyboard with a satisfying click, click, clicking sound as I worked, letting the story take itself wherever it wanted for as long as it wanted to go. A soft, instrumental track with a lo-fi beat played in the headphones wrapped around my ears, and I lost myself to the story, typing away as the day wound on. I had hardly noticed the light of the room shift or begin to fade as the sun began to set. In the silent moments, when one song would become another, we could very faintly hear the soft sound of knocking from the downstairs hallway, no doubt dulled by the distance and the headphones themselves. I smiled to myself for a moment and got back to writing. James must have gotten home, realised that I was sealed up in my office working, and decided, rather than disturb me in my work, that he would finally nail up those picture frames in the hallway that I had asked him to do for me last week. I loved that about him. He may be a bit abrasive at times, but he always cared about the little things eventually, and was always so considerate of me when I was working on something important. I let the thoughts of the story drag me away again, back into the rhythm of typing the story, letting it share its details and the intimate world that it was with me, and in turn, I would share it with the readers. It was rather a lot like using a ouija board, I reflected. You couldn't just put the planchard down on the board and tell it to move and to give it what you wanted. No, you had to sit patiently, waiting, being open to anyone that wanted to come and tell their story. Open, but not insistent or demanding. And when a spirit would wander by and decide to stop in for a chat, you had to be sure to remain patient with them and allow them to tell you what they decided to, in their own time. Like a story, a spirit could not be rushed in an answer or a response. You could ask a question or two, here or there, but you could not really direct a spirit in their story, or get insistent for more details than they were willing to give. If you push too hard with a story, you encounter writer's block. If you push too hard with a spirit, however, well, that is where a lot of the stories of dangerous entities come from. Some spirits will just leave the bird and stop communicating with you, but some get hostile at what they perceive to be an act of disrespect, disbelief, or even a threat. Slowly, the story wound down from my mind, and we could push it no further. I blinked a few times, my eyes adjusting to the darkness of the room after having been focused for so long on the bright screen. I locked my computer and pushed my chair back away from the desk and stood up, crossing out of the room and switching off the light, my phone in hand, to make my way down to the kitchen to say hello to James. As I walked down the hallway from the stairs that led to the kitchen and the living room, I instinctively stepped to one side to avoid the small stack of picture frames that had been sitting in the hallway for the past month, waiting to be hung up, like I did every time I walked down the stairs, and made my way into the kitchen to see about some dinner for myself and James. I was standing in front of the refrigerator, the door ajar, looking over potential ingredients and trying to formulate a meal out of them in my mind, when I realised the picture frames were still on the floor. Hadn't I heard the sound of James hammering nails into the wall for them earlier? I closed the door of the fridge and turned to walk back to the hallway to look. Maybe he had gotten frustrated again and left the job half done. That seemed to be a common thing with him when it came to household projects. But as I looked at the wall above the picture frames, I saw not a single nail sticking out of the sheetrock and paint. No holes either. In fact, the walls were perfectly smooth and clean and as unblemished as ever. Weird. I walked quickly back to the kitchen and looked out the window in the back door that looked out into the driveway. No, his car wasn't even there. It's awfully late for him not to be home from work yet, I remember thinking. Just one of those little details that stick with you, I suppose. I looked down at my phone for the first time. I always kept it on vibrate, so it would never disturb me when I'm writing. I'm too easily distracted sometimes. And sure enough, there was a text from James letting me know that the shop had a lot of work on a big order, they were behind, and everyone would have to stay late to get caught up. He said he'd be home around 10 that night, and not to wait for him to make dinner. He would make himself a sandwich or something when he got home. We checked the time. It was 8:46 p.m. Well, plenty of time to make a nice dinner and surprise him when he got home after such a long day. Poor James. He worked so hard. We set about the kitchen making dinner. Some roasted lemon pepper chicken, one of his favourites, with a fluffy garlic and herb rice pilaf, and some asparagus roasted with olive oil and some fresh cracked black pepper and a little bit of sea salt. In between cooking, I pulled the table out from under the window with the chairs and set out plates, forks, knives and napkins. All the normal silverware, but we usually ate in the living room, so it made it feel like a special occasion. I even nipped upstairs to the bedroom and pulled a couple of candles out of the closet where I kept them and set them up on the table, thinking a nice little candlelight dinner would make a nice surprise after a long day of work. I timed everything perfectly, as it turned out, and was just plating up the meal when his car pulled into the driveway. I just put the plates down on the table, food fresh and hot, as he opened the door. I smiled at him and asked him how work was today. He seemed to look through me for a moment, lost in thought, before his eyes settled on the table and took in the sight of the dinner I had prepared. He turned to look me in the face, his expression inscrutable for a moment, and then he smiled, that winning smile that I always loved about him. "I told you not to wait for me for dinner," he said, with a hint of a laugh in his voice. I blushed and looked down at my feet, feeling like a teenager again, and smiling quietly to myself. "I know, but I thought it would make a nice surprise. I'm allowed to surprise my husband now and then, aren't I?" He agreed that I was, in fact, allowed to surprise him at any time, and we both had a good laugh. Unfortunately, though, he said, he was covered in powder and red rust and who knew what else from work, and needed a shower before he could sit down and eat. He urged me to eat while it was hot, and he could zap it in the microwave when he was all clean. I assured him that I could keep it warm while he showered. That wasn't a problem, and off he went. I deplated the food and returned it to their dishes and popped them into the oven on low to keep things nice and warm while I heard the shower turn on upstairs. Wishing I had a bottle of wine to open, I turned around the kitchen absently for a moment before being struck with an idea. I nipped down the hallway to the linen closet and nabbed a towel before rushing downstairs to throw it in the dryer for a few moments. I always liked a nice warm towel when I got out of the shower. I was sure he would love it. Poor James, having to work late, then come home covered in rust and crime and dirt and whatever strange red powder paint they use at work. The number of clothes we've had to throw away because the stains of that crap wouldn't come out was ridiculous. I fiddled around near the washer and dryer for a few minutes while it spun, spinning the bottles of the different detergents and fabric softeners and the several different stain removers that we used on the shelf so that they were nice and evenly spaced, with the labels facing out, while listening to the slow hum of the dryer, the quiet whoomph of the towel falling from the top of the drum to the bottom every now and then. After a few minutes, I figured James would be just about done showering, and I opened the dryer door. The drum slid to a stop, and I pulled the towel out, nice and toasty, and made my way back upstairs to the main floor, and continued up to the bedroom, folding the towel over my arm as I went. The bathroom door was closed, and the shower was running, like usual. I reached for the doorknob, planning to sneakily open the door, slip in, place the towel on the towel rack, and then sneak out unnoticed while he was in the shower. I smiled at the thought of being a little towel-delivering fairy. But the doorknob did not turn in my palm. It did have a habit of getting stuck now and then, especially if you were taking a particularly hot shower. I jiggled it a little to get it open, my surprise entry ruined. But, to my bewilderment, the door was locked. James heard the doorknob, or maybe my soft gasp of shock at finding the door locked. He'd never locked it before, and called out. I responded that I was just trying to surprise him with a hot towel before the door locked. Instead of reaching out of the shower to unlock the door and let me in, he told me to just leave it on the bed and he'd grab it when he got out. He didn't want to get the floor all wet on me, which was sweet. I left the towel on the bed and pulled out some pyjamas for him, laying them out on his side of the bed, closest to the bathroom door, and made my way downstairs as the shower water turned off. I gave it a couple of minutes for him to dry and get dressed before pulling the food back out of the oven and plating it back up. He came swaggering into the kitchen, his eyes sparkling bright, and his dirty blonde hair sat wet and ruffled, then sat down at the table while I brought the plates over. He ate quickly, like he was starving. Poor James! I had only packed him a lunch for the afternoon. He probably hadn't eaten in hours. He was ravenous, and quickly finished the plate before I had even a quarter of my own food. He got up to look for seconds as I asked him about work and who had screwed up to make them all have to stay for overtime. It was an unusual occurrence, certainly, but it did happen from time to time. He seemed not to hear me as he fixed himself a second plate of food, grumpily complaining that I hadn't made enough asparagus. I laughed a little, as I always did when he made such complaints. I know he doesn't mean anything by them, other than that he wanted a second helping of the vegetable. I offered mine, which he declined, and then sat back down to eat some more. I sat, watching him expectantly. For a moment, he looked up at me, watching him, and then he asked, rather gruffly through a mouthful of chicken, why the hell I was staring at him. I was taken aback for a moment. He never talks to me that way, and I flinched from the tone. I couldn't help it. It was just filled with such anger, and he had never directed that anger towards me before. In a small, quiet voice, I replied, I had asked you how work was, with the overtime and all. My voice trailed off into silence, and I dropped my face down to look at my plate, stabbing a piece of asparagus quietly with my fork and bringing it timidly up to my mouth. He grunted a little and said it was fine. Just fine. No description of what he did, no complaints about co-workers, no information about what had happened to make the overtime necessary. That was it. Work was fine. It was unlike him to be so quiet, but after the sudden outburst of anger, it was doubly strange. I didn't know what to say or do, so I just sat quietly and slowly finished my dinner, my appetite completely gone. When he finished, he put his plate in the sink and walked out of the room with a quick, "Thanks, babe," and headed upstairs. I looked up to give him a smile, but he was already gone. I stood up and scraped my plate and placed it in the sink, feeling really dejected. I had really wanted to make it a nice night for him after he had to work unexpected mandatory overtime. I set about cleaning the kitchen, putting leftovers into containers and wiping down the stovetop. I felt like perhaps I had done something wrong, rather than something nice for him. Could he really be this upset about asparagus? It was such a little thing that it made no sense for him to be that angry over it. He normally didn't get angry like that. As I was washing the dishes, I shook my head at myself. There I went again, being a stereotypical woman and overthinking everything. How many times had James told me that? I definitely suffer from that bad habit, but I do my best to work on it, because I want to be the best partner that I can for James. I think that's what really makes our relationship work, you know? We can always communicate, no matter whether it's good or bad. If I tell him something negative, he knows I'm not trying to be critical, but rather he sees it as an area of improvement he can work on. And I'm the same way. If he tells me something could be better, I don't take it negatively and actively try to improve. even if I do fall into the trap of overthinking things sometimes. I caught myself this time though. It's important to catch yourself in negative brain patterns. He had just had a long day at work, I scolded myself. He wasn't expecting to have to work until 10 p.m. tonight. He usually went in at 6 o'clock in the morning. He must be exhausted. And of course, he missed dinner because he was usually home well before that. He probably had to stay late because some new guy messed up again, and that has to be frustrating. And then I had probably startled him when he was in the shower and just trying to relax. Of course, he'd be a little irritable. I'm sure he didn't mean anything by it, and resolved to talk to him about the behaviour that bothered me tomorrow. I wouldn't do it now, while he was so tired. I'd bring it up during our download dinner tomorrow. When I finished cleaning up the kitchen, I turned off the light and headed upstairs for a quick shower. James was already in bed, passed out under the blankets, his hair sprawled out around him as he lay out on the pillow. I smiled to myself as I slipped into the bathroom, closing the door behind me before turning on the light so that I wouldn't wake him up. Poor James, so tired. I was so lucky to have him. He works so hard for us. I was really lucky to have such a great husband. Sure, we might disagree sometimes, or I might end up going to bed alone after he'd fallen asleep because I couldn't calm down enough so that I wouldn't wake him. But in the end, we always talked things out, and our marriage got stronger for it. I climbed into bed next to him a little while later, being careful not to wake him as I slipped into the covers and lay still so that I wouldn't wake him up by mistake, and looked over at the far wall while I waited for sleep, reminding myself of just how lucky I was to have this perfect little life with my loving husband. I was just starting to drift off to sleep when I felt it again. The sudden wave of cold air rolled over me, starting at my face and rolling back over my shoulders towards where James lay, asleep in the bed. Goosebumps sprouted on my arms and legs, despite my long pants and blankets, as I watched with a strange sense of fascination as the skin contracted around the follicles of the little hairs in my arm, making them stand up on end. My eyes, that had been heavy and half closed with drowsiness, popped wide open, staring intently at the darkness in front of me, and I was intensely trying to focus on the little spots of texture in the paint, as though to convince myself that the darkness of the room was total and complete, but there was in fact enough light to see anything by. As I lay, paralysed by fear of choking from the cold and hitting into James to wake him up for no reason, I forced myself to remain perfectly still as the spiked ball of ice rolled slowly down my spine, sending pinprick-like tingles through my body. I was hyper-aware of every muscle in my arm wanting to contract and spasm as it rolled past my shoulder blades, and fought to tighten every muscle manually and hold it taut so that I wouldn't jerk my arms or fingers. As it rolled down my back, I tensed up as hard as I could as I felt it roil down my spine, moving slowly from one vertebrae to the next, threatening to send jolting spasms through me. I noticed that my breathing had become erratic. I was panting loudly, the air whooshing out of my nose. I worried it would wake James, and I held my breath as the frigid shudder continued its way down my spine, tensing my legs so tightly they burned with the effort as it rolled over my hips and down my legs, ever aware of the fear of letting them jerk, lest I wake up James, and suffer his rage once more. We laid like that for hours and hours, unable to move a muscle, freezing in the cold despite the warm blankets lying over me, and with the darkness pressing in on my eyes. Cold. It was so cold and dark. Not as if the street lamps outside had turned off and plunged the room into darkness, but simply as though there was nothing there to see at all.